The Galactic Council tried to silence humanity. Instead, they awakened it. The vote was already over when I walked into the chamber. I knew at the moment I saw the light above the main platform. It had turned blue. Blue meant unanimous. In 7 years of working as a diplomatic attaché for the human delegation, I had never once seen that light turn blue. The Galactic Council argued about everything. They argued about trade routes and territorial boundaries and the correct pronunciation of formal addresses. They argued for sport. They argued because arguing was how they reminded each other that they still existed. But today, every single one of them agreed. My name is Kale Voss. I am 34 years old. I grew up in a small town in the north of England, the son of a school teacher and a man who fixed old radios for a hobby. I was not supposed to be the kind of person who stood in galactic chambers. I was not a general or a politician or a genius. I had gotten here through stubbornness and a talent for learning languages. I spoke 9 alien dialects well enough to be useful, and I had spent the last 7 years making myself invisible in rooms where history was being made. Today, history had been made without me even knowing it was happening. Delegate Harlan, the senior human ambassador, was standing near the far wall. He was a tall man, silver-haired, usually calm in the way that people are calm when they have seen too much of the world to be surprised by any of it. But right now he was gripping the railing next to him with both hands, and his face was the color of old paper. I moved toward him through the thinning crowd of alien delegates. Several of them glanced at me. A few looked away quickly. The Veldhari delegate, a tall, gray-skinned figure who had always been polite to me at formal events, did not look away. He looked directly at me with his enormous black eyes, and what I saw in them was not hostility. It was something worse. It was pity. I reached Harlan and kept my voice low. I asked him what had happened. He did not answer immediately. He watched the last few delegates file out through their respective exits. When the chamber was nearly empty, he turned to me and said the words that would change everything. The council had passed the silence accord. I did not understand at first. The silence accord had been a proposal on the discussion table for nearly 2 years. It had been introduced by the Keth Federation as a measure to reduce what they called electromagnetic excess in newly settled regions. The human diplomatic team had read it as a minor technical regulation and had pushed back on 2 clauses that affected our deep space communication networks. We had expected a compromise. We had expected more arguing. We had expected the usual slow grind of galactic bureaucracy. We had not expected a unanimous vote. We had not expected it to pass at all. Harlan pulled out a small data card and handed it to me. I read the summary in 30 seconds. The accord did not just restrict signals in new settlement zones. It established a 200 light-year communication suppression field centered on the solar system. Every human transmission, civilian or government, cultural or scientific, personal or political, was to be intercepted and terminated at the boundary. No signal in, no signal out. The stated reason was signal pollution and the protection of developing alien civilizations in nearby regions. I stood there reading it twice because I could not believe it the first time. Then Harlan told me the part that was not in the summary. He told me quietly, with his back to the remaining council staff across the room, that he had been approached 2 days ago by a Veldhari junior official who was troubled by what he had witnessed in the closed session. This official, who had risked a great deal to pass on the information, had told Harlan the real words spoken behind those doors, words that never made it into the official record. The council did not fear our signals because they caused interference. They feared our signals because of what was inside them. A senior Keth Council member had said, and these were the exact words as relayed to Harlan, that humanity was a contagion of ideas, that our art and our science and our stories spread in ways that destabilized other civilizations, that species who consumed human culture began asking questions that their own societies had not prepared them to answer. That 1 century of human presence in the galactic community had already caused 3 documented instances of internal political unrest among member species. Not because humans had done anything aggressive, but because humans could not stop creating things, and those things made people think. And thinking, apparently, was the one force the Council had no defense against. They had not silenced us because we were dangerous in the way a weapon is dangerous. They had silenced us because we were dangerous in the way a question is dangerous. I walked out of that chamber and onto the observation deck of the station. Below me, through 3 meters of reinforced transparence, the stars were doing what they always do. They were burning. Indifferent, beautiful, permanent. Somewhere among them, about 100 light years from where I stood, was the sun. It was too small to see from here without instruments. Earth was even smaller. Billions of people going about their lives right now, talking and arguing and making music and falling in love and making terrible jokes and writing things down that no one had ever thought to write before. All of that was about to go dark at the edges. They would still talk to each other, but the galaxy would stop hearing them. I stayed on that deck for a long time. The transport back to Earth left at dawn, station time. I was on it. I spent the journey in my small bunk with the lights off, staring at the ceiling, thinking about my father and his old radios. He used to say that every radio is just a box that believes the air is full of voices. You just have to tune it right. I thought about that the whole way home. When I landed, when I stepped out onto actual ground under an actual sky, I looked up. The stars were still there, faint in the afternoon blue, invisible really but present. They had always been there. We had just spent a few decades learning to reach them. I noticed something that afternoon. I noticed it in the faces of the people I passed on the street, the ones who had already seen the news. There was no panic, no tears. There was a quietness that was not defeat. It was the quietness of people who have just been told no by someone they never agreed to obey. It was the quietness before something begins. I had grown up watching old recordings of human history, the kind they show you in school. I had seen what happened every time someone tried to put a wall around an idea. I had studied the patterns. I had written a dissertation about them. Every wall ever built around an idea had eventually served the same purpose, not to stop the idea, to define its shape, to show people exactly what was being taken from them and make them want it more. The Council had just drawn the clearest possible border around human thought and called it forbidden. I already knew what was coming next. I just did not yet know I would be the one to help build it. I went home. I called my mother. I told her things would be fine. I did not entirely believe that yet, but I needed to say it out loud to hear how it sounded. It sounded like the beginning of something. 6 months after the vote, the sky above Aberdeen was the kind of gray that seemed personal. I had been back in England for most of that time, technically on extended administrative leave from the diplomatic service. In practice, I spent my days in a rented flat with 4 other people, crammed around a table covered in coffee cups and outdated schematics, trying to figure out how to talk to a galaxy that had been told not to listen. The silence accord had gone into effect on schedule. The suppression field, built from 17 Council relay stations, repositioned into a rough sphere around our solar system, was operational within 40 days of the vote. The engineers among us had studied the architecture carefully. It was elegant and thorough and built by a civilization that had been managing communication infrastructure for 10,000 years. Every broad-spectrum human signal that reached the boundary was absorbed, analyzed, and dissolved. No errors, no gaps. At least none that the Council had bothered to look for. Because here is the thing about a field designed to catch signals. It is designed to catch signals that look like signals. It is designed to intercept structured transmissions moving in predictable directions toward known relay points. What it is not designed for. What no civilization that had evolved beyond chaos would ever think to design for is noise. And humans, it turned out, are very good at noise. The woman who explained this to me was called Petra. She was a radio engineer from a small university in Portugal who had been studying deep space signal degradation for 12 years and had an opinion about everything and was almost always right. She had dark eyes and the kind of focus that made people feel slightly nervous around her, and she had been working on this problem since the day the Accord passed. She sat me down in front of a screen covered in waveform diagrams and told me that every suppression field has a threshold. It catches signals above a certain power and coherence level, because below that threshold, the field cannot distinguish a transmission from natural background radiation. The Council had set the threshold based on standard galactic communication parameters that did not account for the kind of deliberately degraded, fragmented, intentionally ugly signals that a species raised on encryption and amateur radio, and 30 years of bypassing content filters might think to design. What Petra was describing was not a broadcast. It was a whisper spread across 10,000 frequencies at once, each piece of it below the threshold, each piece meaningless on its own, but together, reconstructed at the other end by a receiver that knew what to look for, forming something complete. She called it the pulse. It took 3 months to build the first working prototype. It took another 3 months to convince enough people to carry receiver nodes out past the suppression boundary on supply vessels, maintenance ships, and in one case, a very confused deep space geology team who were told they were testing a new mineral scanner. And then we started talking. We did not start with political statements. We did not start with demands or manifestos. We started with music. Petra had argued for this from the beginning, and the others had eventually agreed, because music required no translation. You did not need to understand the language to feel the structure. You did not need to know what the words meant to understand that something human had made them, and that something human had poured itself into them. The first package we sent was 47 minutes long. It contained recordings from every inhabited continent, every major tradition, every instrument we could fit in the compression. Folk songs from the Appalachians and throat singing from Mongolia, and a string quartet from Vienna, and a 10-minute piece composed specifically for the broadcast by a young man from Lagos who had been working on it since the day the Accord passed. He had called it The Answer. We had no idea if anyone received it. We had no idea if the nodes were even working. The pulse was designed to be invisible, which meant we had no way of confirming our own transmissions without betraying ourselves. So we kept sending. The second package was scientific. 3 papers that human researchers had submitted to galactic journals and been quietly rejected after the Accord. One described a new theoretical approach to faster-than-light communication that contradicted 200 years of Keth consensus. One detailed a medical discovery that could potentially be adapted to treat a degenerative disease affecting 3 council species. One was a mathematical proof, 40 pages long, resolving an open problem that the Veldhari Academy had declared formally unsolvable in a conference attended by 800 alien scholars. We included a short note with the math paper. It said, in standard galactic script, "We noticed no one had figured this out yet. You are welcome." Petra thought the note was too aggressive. I thought it was exactly right. We argued about it for 3 days. We sent it with the note. The resistance, which had by then quietly stopped calling itself a resistance because the name felt theatrical, had grown considerably from the original 5 people in that Aberdeen flat. There were now cells operating from 19 countries, with participants ranging from retired signal engineers to university students, to one very committed grandmother in Osaka who had previously directed all of her considerable organizational energy toward running a community garden. She had switched over with minimal adjustment. She said soil and signal were not so different. You put something in, you wait, and eventually something comes back out. The council enforcement teams found our first node 3 weeks after we activated it. A salvage vessel near the boundary had come too close, and their instruments had registered an anomalous signal pattern. The node went dark before they could identify it properly. The team that ran it had already moved on. We lost 7 nodes over the next 2 months. Each one was found, each one was shut down, and each time the enforcement team published a notice about signal violations. A dozen more people contacted us asking how to get involved. The council had a word for what we were doing. In 3 of their primary languages, it translated roughly to reckless defiance. One translation was closer to noise pollution. We preferred that one. We kept building. We kept sending. We developed better compression, better fragmentation patterns, more creative routing through natural phenomena, bouncing signals off asteroid fields and comet tails and the magnetic wakes of gas giants. It was not efficient. It was not clean. It was thoroughly, defiantly human. I was running the logistics for 4 separate broadcast cells when the message arrived. It came in through the pulse, which was unusual because we rarely received anything back through it. The nodes were not designed for incoming signals, but someone out there had figured out how we were working, and they had built something that fit our pattern. The message was 12 words long. It was in standard Galactic script. It said, "I have been listening for 2 years. I want to talk." It was not from Earth. It was not from any human. I sat with that message for a long time. Petra leaned over my shoulder and read it and then stood back and did not say anything for almost a full minute, which for Petra was extraordinary. Then she said that someone out there had been sitting alone with human signals for 2 years, hiding it from everyone they knew, until they found a way to write back. I thought about what kind of person does that. What kind of person risks everything just to say they have been listening? The kind of person, I thought, who needed to hear something and finally had. I wrote back. The name of the person who had been listening was S. Sarah. She was a Veldhari archivist, which meant she worked in one of the great preservation vaults that her species maintained across their territory. The Veldhari had been archiving the records of other civilizations for longer than humans had been writing things down. They were careful, methodical people who believed that their highest purpose was to protect the past for the future. Innovation was, in their culture, a form of disrespect toward what had already been perfected. Sarah had first encountered human material 3 years before the Accord, when a Veldhari survey vessel had passed through a region of space and picked up a broad signal that had been drifting for a decade. It was a radio broadcast from Earth, an old one, a recording of a live performance by a singer who had been dead for 40 years. The survey team had logged it as noise and moved on. Sarah had flagged it for archival review. That was her job. She had listened to it while cataloging the file. She told me later that she had not known what to do with what it made her feel. The Veldhari did not have a word for the particular combination of sadness and joy and longing and belonging that the recording produced in her. She knew it was a response, a genuine emotional response of a kind her training told her was not really possible from contact with alien material. She had checked her notes to make sure she had filed the correct species designation. She had checked twice. Then she had started a private archive. For 3 years, Sarah had been collecting every human transmission she could access through legitimate Veldhari intelligence channels. Music, literature, scientific papers, recordings of speeches and arguments and comedy performances, films from the 20th century, a 2-hour documentary about people who rebuilt antique clocks, 17 episodes of a cooking competition program, and somewhere in there, a doctoral dissertation on the philosophy of language written by a student in Cape Town that she told me she had read 9 times. She had told nobody. The Veldhari had strict regulations about unauthorized archival projects. She had been risking her position and potentially more. For 3 years before the Silence Accord passed. When the Accord passed, Sarah said, she had experienced something she had even less of a word for. She described it as the feeling of watching a door be locked that you had been standing next to, not sure whether to walk through, and only realizing too late that you had wanted to walk through very badly. She had spent the 3 months after the Accord trying to figure out how to write to us. She had done it without any outside help, using her archival access to study our signal patterns until she understood the pulse structure well enough to construct a reply. It had taken her until now. She wrote to me every day after that first message. I wrote back. We were careful always about what we included and how we rooted it. She was taking enormous risks. I did not want her to take more than she could bear. But she was not the only one. About 3 weeks into our correspondence, Sarah began mentioning others. A Keth engineer named Vor, who had been quietly publishing human mathematical methods as his own work for 2 years and knew exactly where those methods had come from. A young Murran artist who had been using structural forms from human painting in her architectural designs and described them to her colleagues as natural evolution. A researcher from a species called the Davar who had developed an inexplicable interest in human history and had published 4 academic papers in the past year that her colleagues found unusually direct in their conclusions, a quality not traditionally admired in Davar scholarship. They had not been in contact with each other. They had each, separately in their own corners of the galaxy, found human material and kept it close like something private and necessary. Sarah knew about them because the Veldhari archival network crossed paths with everyone eventually, and Sarah had learned to notice certain patterns in information requests. I started to understand the shape of what was actually happening. The Council had framed the Silence Accord as a protective measure. They had presented humanity as a disruptive force, something that caused instability in healthy systems, and in a narrow sense, they were not entirely wrong. Human culture did cause instability, but they had described it as though instability was automatically damage, as though something shaking a system must be breaking it. What they had not accounted for was that some systems are not working properly and need to be shaken. Within 2 months of making contact with Sarah, I had messages from 11 individuals across 7 species. None of them knew each other. All of them had found human material independently. All of them had kept it to themselves. And all of them, when they finally reached out, said some version of the same thing. They said they had not realized, before encountering human culture, that they were allowed to want more than their society had given them. I did not write that down in any official record. It felt too large for a report. It felt like something that needed to be held carefully. Back on Earth, the Pulse network had grown into something I could barely track anymore. Petra had handed off most of the operational management to a team in New Zealand that had developed a broadcast compression method twice as efficient as anything we had built in the Aberdeen flat. They were sending full-length films now, documentaries, lecture series, an entire archive of human scientific literature. They had also started including live material, things recorded in the past few weeks, current events, contemporary music, recent publications. It was not a broadcast anymore. It was something closer to an open hand. The Council noticed. Of course they noticed. Enforcement notices were being issued every 2 weeks. Several human vessels had been detained near the boundary and searched for transmission equipment. 2 cell members had been formally identified and faced significant pressure from the Council to cease operations. They had not ceased. But it was inside the Council itself that the most interesting fractures were forming. Sarah told me about them carefully, in careful language, routing her messages through 3 different relay structures we had built together. She told me that 2 minor member species had asked in a closed session why the accord had been passed without open debate. The answer they received was unsatisfactory. They asked again. The answer was the same, and the Council moved to the next item on the agenda. But the question had been asked. And in galactic politics, as in all politics, a question asked twice becomes a question that refuses to disappear. She told me that a Veldhari academic journal had been quietly asked to retract an article praising a piece of alien mathematical work, after someone in the Council's information office noticed that the mathematical methods bore a suspicious resemblance to a human paper published 4 years earlier. The journal had asked on what grounds. No satisfactory grounds had been provided. The journal had published a second article instead, defending the first. She told me that an internal review had been quietly opened into whether the Davar researcher who had been writing unusually direct papers had been influenced by human sources. The researcher had responded to the review board with a document 700 pages long, explaining in precise detail every source she had used, and nodding that she was not aware of any regulation that made intellectual clarity a violation. The council was pulling threads, but the threads were part of a very large fabric, and the more they pulled, the more they revealed how much of the galaxy had already been quietly listening. I contacted Sarah one morning to find a message waiting that was longer than usual. She had listed, carefully, the names and species of everyone she had identified who had made contact with human material in some form. The list had 49 entries. At the bottom she had written, "I believe this is incomplete by an order of magnitude." I read that line several times. Then I walked to the window of the flat and looked out at the sky, which was doing its usual thing of being complicated and gray and full of movement. Something had already started, not because we had planned it, not because we were powerful, but because ideas, once they are free and real and felt in the chest rather than merely stored in the mind, do not wait to be invited. The Council had tried to protect the galaxy from human thought by removing the source. They had not considered that the thought was already out there, already inside their borders, already changing the minds of people who had never been to Earth and never met a human face to face. It was too late to unring a bell that had been ringing for 50 years. And we had not yet begun to ring it properly. The planning took 4 weeks. During those 4 weeks, I slept approximately 4 hours a night, ate whatever was handed to me, and had a total of 3 arguments with Petra, 2 of which I was wrong about, and 1 of which I was right about but graciously did not press. We called it the cacophony event, which was Petra's name for it, and which she had chosen partly because it was accurate and partly, I suspected, because she enjoyed the way Council communications staff would have to write it in formal reports. The concept was simple, the execution was not. The Council suppression field worked because human signals were concentrated, directional, and predictable. The pulse network had proven that fragmented, low-coherent signals could slip through below the detection threshold. What we had been doing so far was essentially whispering. Careful, precise whispers. The cacophony event was not a whisper. It was the moment we stopped caring whether they heard us coming. Because for this to work, we needed something the Council had not anticipated. We needed alien transmitters. Sarah had been building toward this quietly for weeks. She and the others, Vor and the Murin artist whose name was Ella and the Davar researcher called Ren, had each in their own networks identified individuals with access to legitimate transmitters, relay nodes, and broadcast infrastructure outside human space. Not many individuals, not enough to be a network in any formal sense, but enough. On the morning of the broadcast, 73 separate transmission sources across 11 star systems came online within a 17-minute window. 41 of them were human, 32 were not. 32 alien transmitters, operated by individuals who had never met each other, many of whom had never met a human, chose to open themselves for 72 hours to carry our signal. I do not have a word for what that felt like. I know Petra cried when the confirmation signals came in, though she would deny it later with complete conviction. What we sent was not a statement. It was not a demand. It was not an argument for human rights or a condemnation of the Council or a political position of any kind. We had debated this at length, and what we had landed on was this. If the Council feared human culture for what it did to other minds, then the most honest and most powerful response was to show exactly what that culture was, without filter, without curation, without anything removed. We sent everything. We sent the oldest cave paintings we had records of, and we sent a short film made last year by a 14-year-old in Buenos Aires about his neighborhood. We sent a recording of the first moon landing, the original, with all the static and the broken sentences, and the quiet all underneath the professional calm. We sent mathematical proofs and cooking recipes and architectural plans and 100 years of scientific papers. We sent every genre of music we had compressed into a continuous 72-hour stream, organized not by origin or tradition, but by emotional shape, moving from grief to joy to longing to courage to humor to wonder and back again. We sent arguments, real ones, people disagreeing in good faith about important things, showing the process of minds changing in real time. The council species had interpreted human debate as chaos. We wanted them to see it as it actually was, which was how a species that did not have all the answers tried to find more of them. We sent comedy, 2 full hours of it from 6 different centuries. I had argued for this more strongly than almost anything else. Humor is the hardest thing to translate and the most revealing thing about a mind. You cannot understand a species until you understand what makes them laugh. And when you do understand it, it is almost impossible not to feel some kind of connection to them. We sent love letters. With permission, collected over 3 months from volunteers around the world, letters written to people living and dead, letters written to children and to parents and to friends and to strangers who had done small kindnesses. We translated them into 12 galactic languages. They were, by a significant margin, the most accessed files in the entire broadcast according to our monitoring data. In hour 18, the Council moved to activate emergency suppression protocols. The protocols worked on human transmitters. 29 of our 41 nodes went dark. The 32 alien transmitters kept broadcasting. There is no polite way to describe what happened inside the council chambers in the next 12 hours. So I will simply say that the transcripts Sara later obtained suggest that several very old and very formal individuals said things to each other that had not been said in those chambers in living memory. The council could not suppress its own member infrastructure without essentially declaring that the accord applied to non-human transmitters as well, which it did not, which they had never intended it to, because it had never occurred to them that non-humans would choose to carry our signal. In hour 31, with the broadcast still running through our alien-operated nodes, I released the transcripts. I had been holding them for the right moment. They were the full, unredacted records of the closed session in which the silence accord had been passed, the words that the Veldhari official had passed to Harlan 2 years earlier, the exact language used, the exact reasoning given. Humanity was a contagion of ideas. Human culture made other beings believe they were capable of more. Those 2 sentences, released into a galaxy that had just spent 31 hours consuming human music and science and love letters and arguments and comedy, landed differently than they would have 2 days earlier. 3 council member species issued immediate statements calling for a review of the accord. 2 more issued statements calling for a review of the closed session policy. 1 species, the Murren, whose artist Ella had been carrying our signal from the beginning, formally withdrew from the accord, citing a clause in their membership agreement that allowed them to exempt cultural exchange materials from suppression directives. The remaining council members issued condemnations. They were eloquent condemnations, formally structured, citing multiple points of galactic law. Nobody read them. Not because they were not distributed. They were distributed. They went out on every council channel and every official relay and every formal news service. But the galaxy had just spent 2 days with its hands full of human things, human ideas, human voices, and the condemnations sounded like what they were, the sound of people who had decided to be afraid of something and were now watching everyone else decide not to be. In hour 67, the suppression field flickered. Petra noticed it first. She was watching the boundary monitoring data, and she grabbed my arm without looking up and pointed at the screen. The field was not failing completely. It was losing coherence in several sectors, not because of technical failure, but because 6 of the relay stations that maintained it belonged to species that had just voted to withdraw from the accord. When you remove the post, the fence falls. At hour 71, 40 minutes before the planned end of the broadcast, the last major suppression sector collapsed. Our remaining nodes came back online automatically. The full signal spread outward at the speed of light in every direction. I was in the flat. It was early morning, the sky outside doing its best impression of a sunrise, and every screen in the room was showing different data feeds, and the noise level was extraordinary. Petra was on the phone with the New Zealand team. 3 people were talking at once in the corner. Someone had made tea at some point and it was sitting on the table getting cold. I stepped outside. It was quiet out there. A normal street, early morning, a few people walking dogs, a delivery van doing its rounds. An ordinary day on an ordinary planet that had just spent 72 hours shouting itself at the galaxy through a crack it had made in a wall built to contain it. My communicator lit up. Messages. Hundreds of them, then more incoming signals from outside the boundary, routed through nodes that were now active again. From Sara, from Vor, from Ella, from Ren, from people I had never heard of. The first message I opened was from Sara. It said, "The field is down. We can hear everything. Do you have any idea how loud you are?" I laughed out loud on that empty street alone, at 5 in the morning, for a long time. Then I wrote back and told her, yes, actually. We have always known exactly how loud we are. That was the point. What comes after the wall falls is always more complicated than what came before it. I had understood this in theory before the cacophony event. I had studied enough history to know that the moment of defiance is not the ending. It is the beginning of the harder work. But knowing something and living it are different categories of experience, and the year that followed the collapse of the suppression field was the most difficult and the most important year of my life. The Galactic Council did not collapse. I want to be clear about that, because many of the accounts that circulated afterward made it sound as though the broadcast had simply swept the old order away. It had not. The Council was 10,000 years old. Its roots went deeper than any single event. What the cacophony event had done was fracture its surface and expose the divisions that had always been present beneath it. Divisions between species who had chosen stability over growth and species who were beginning to question whether that choice had cost them something they could not name, but had always felt the absence of. The 6 months after the broadcast were a period of intense and often exhausting galactic diplomacy. I was in the middle of most of it, not because I was the most senior person available. I was not. But because I knew Sara and Vor and Ella and Ren and the others, and because I had learned over 2 years of building the pulse that the most important conversations in any political situation are the ones that happen between people who trust each other rather than between institutions that do not. Harlan was still our senior ambassador. He was better at the formal sessions than I was, and we had found a rhythm where he handled the council chambers and I handled everything else. Everything else was considerable. The review of the Silence Accord took 4 months. It was a genuine review, conducted by a committee that included 3 human representatives, delegates from the 6 species that had broken from the Accord, and a neutral arbitration team from the Murin, who had by then become probably our most consistent allies in the Council. The review produced a 400-page document that was careful and thorough, and said, in precise legal language, what Sara had said to me in 12 words 2 years earlier. The Accord was not justified by the evidence. Its stated purpose did not match its actual mechanism. Its passage in closed session had violated 3 separate transparency provisions in the Council Charter. It was formally dissolved. I was not in the chamber when the dissolution vote was announced. I was in a corridor outside, sitting on a bench with my head back against the wall, too tired to feel anything in particular. Harlan came out and told me. I nodded. He sat down next to me and we were quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had worked in galactic diplomacy for 30 years, and he had never seen anything like what we had built over the past 2 years. Not the technology, not the broadcast, but the thing underneath it all. The fact that 32 individuals from 11 different species had chosen to risk something real for a civilization they had never been to. I told him I thought about that a lot. I thought about Vor, who had spent 2 years crediting human mathematics to himself not out of dishonesty, but out of fear of what would happen if he said openly where the ideas had come from, and who had then, when the moment came, opened his transmitter anyway. I thought about Ella, who had told me that the first time she heard human music she had sat in her studio and looked at everything she had ever made and understood why it had never quite said what she wanted it to say. I thought about Wren, who had written 700 pages of meticulous academic sourcing to a review board and had titled the document, in a very deliberate choice for a Davar scholar, "We are allowed to be curious." I thought about Sarah, who had hidden a private archive for 3 years and then rebuilt our entire broadcast architecture just to write back. Harlan asked me what we were going to do next. I told him I had been thinking about that. The old council had been built on a model that worked well for the oldest civilizations, the ones that had reached a certain level of stability and wanted to maintain it. It was good at preserving things. It was very poor at welcoming new ones. Humanity had been a junior member, tolerated but not incorporated, present but not heard, for 50 years. We had spent those years adapting ourselves to a table that had not been built with us in mind. What I wanted was a different table. Not one that humanity controlled. Not one where we replaced one dominant voice with another. A table built on a principle that Harlan found elegantly simple and diplomatically terrifying, which was generally a sign that it was the right principle. No civilization may be silenced for the content of its ideas, only for the consequences of its actions. That sentence had taken 3 weeks and 4 separate argument sessions to finalize. It was short enough to be clear and broad enough to matter and specific enough to exclude the kind of vague fear that the Keth had used to justify the accord. It left room for disagreement about actions while protecting the space in which ideas could exist. It became the first line of the founding charter of the Open Assembly. The Open Assembly was not a replacement for the Council. It was a parallel structure, open to all member and non-member species, operating without the Council's seniority hierarchies or closed session privileges. Any species could observe. Any recognized delegation could speak. Decisions required transparent debate and recorded votes. 18 species signed the founding charter in the first 6 months. Several of them had been long-time council members who were not leaving the council, but who wanted to be part of something that operated differently. 3 of them were species humanity had never had formal diplomatic contact with, who had encountered the cacophony broadcast and had sent representatives to ask what the Open Assembly was and whether they could join. The first formal session of the Open Assembly was held on the same station where I had stood watching the silence accord pass 2 years earlier. The chamber was different, a larger one, borrowed for the occasion, and it was not blue-lit. It was loud and slightly chaotic, and 3 separate translation protocols were running simultaneously, and at one point the Murrin delegate and the Keth delegate were both trying to speak at once about the same procedural point. I sat in the human delegation section and listened to all of it. I thought about my father and his radios. I thought about him sitting at the kitchen table with the covers off some old receiver, listening to static with total patience, waiting for the frequency to clear. He used to say that the signal was always there. You just had to stay still enough to find it. Sarah was sitting 3 rows over in the Veldhari section. We had met in person twice by then, which had been a strange and significant experience for both of us. She had told me that humans were louder in person than she had expected from the recordings, and I had told her that Veldhari were taller than she had looked in the official images, and we had both found this very funny, which was, she said, the most human thing that had ever happened to her. She caught my eye across the chamber. She made a gesture with her hand that I had learned was Veldhari for something close to finally. I was appointed humanity's first permanent voice to the Open Assembly. The title was chosen carefully. Not ambassador, not representative, but voice. Because what we were there to do was not to negotiate positions on behalf of a nation-state. We were there to make sure humanity was heard and to make sure we heard back. My first formal address to the Assembly was short. I had written many drafts, and then I had thrown them all away and written the one that said what I actually meant. I said that humanity was not here to teach anyone anything they had not already figured out on their own. I said that every species that had connected with human material and felt something shift in their understanding had already carried that capacity inside themselves. We had not given them new minds. We had, maybe, given them permission to use the ones they had. I said that what I had learned over the past 2 years, from Sarah and Vor and Ella and Ren, and every other individual who had quietly kept human things close at personal cost, was that the hunger to understand, to ask why, to reach past what is already known, was not a uniquely human quality. It was a quality that certain kinds of societies had learned to suppress because it was inconvenient for stability, and that suppressing it did not make it go away. It made it wait. I said we were not here to be disruptive. We were here to be honest. And honesty, in a community that had been running on carefully maintained agreement for a long time, was going to feel like disruption. That was not our fault. That was just what truth sounds like when it enters a quiet room. There was a long moment of silence when I finished. Then the Murrin delegates started the formal applause, which in their tradition involves 3 short percussive sounds made with the flat of the hand, and then the Veldhari section joined, and then most of the room, in whatever way their respective physiologies allowed, made some kind of sound that meant the same thing. I sat down. Harlan leaned over and told me quietly that was either the best or worst thing I had ever said in a formal setting, and we would know which in about 6 months. He was right. We would know in 6 months. There were difficult sessions ahead. There were member species who remained hostile. There were genuine disputes about the limits of the Assembly's authority and about what consequences for actions actually meant in practice, and about 17 other things that were going to require years of careful work. But we had time. For the first time in 2 years, we had time, because the wall was down and the signal was out, and the question had been asked in every language. We had the capacity to transmit, and it was already answering itself in the minds of people across the galaxy who were sitting somewhere alone thinking about something they had heard, something they had felt, something that had made them want more. Some walls, once you break them, cannot be rebuilt, not because the stones are gone, because the people who would have accepted living behind them have changed. A year ago, someone had tried to close the door on everything humanity was. They had looked at us, at all our noise and our making, and our restless inability to leave things as they were, and they had decided we were dangerous. They were not wrong, but they had mistaken the nature of the danger. We were not dangerous because we would ever have fought for domination. We were not dangerous because we wanted to tear anything down. We were dangerous because we made people want to build. And in a galaxy that had spent 10,000 years preserving what already existed, that was the most radical thing imaginable. I left the chamber after the session ended. I walked to the same observation deck where I had stood alone 2 years before, watching the stars while the council voted to erase us. The stars were still there. They are always there. But they felt different now. Not closer exactly, just more like something that belonged to everyone. Sarah found me there 20 minutes later. She stood next to me and we looked at the same stars, and she was quiet for a while, which was her way of being present, and I was quiet too, which was my way of appreciating it. She asked me what I was thinking. I told her I was thinking about my father's radios, about how every one of them was just a box that believed the air was full of voices, how you just had to tune it right. She asked if the air really was full of voices. I told her yes, always had been. We just had to keep transmitting until someone built a receiver. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said that was either very profound or very obvious. I told her it was both. The best things usually are. We stood there for a long time after that, 2 people from 2 different worlds, listening to the quiet of space that was no longer empty and no longer forbidden, that was full, as it had always been, of everything that anyone had ever had the courage to say. They had tried to silence us. They had succeeded, for a moment, the way you can succeed at holding water in your hands. They had given us that moment, and we had used it to build something they had never anticipated. because they had tried to understand humanity as a signal to be suppressed rather than as a source. You cannot suppress a source. You can only wait and see what it makes next.